Hey, Kings Hill family. I hope you are doing great this week. I hope that you were blessed by the sermon this past Sunday. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, I encourage you to go watch it. I've been reflecting on confession since Jonathan preached on Sunday, and just thought it would be helpful if I could maybe share a little bit of my story when it comes to confession. And a lot of the thoughts I will share here have been shaped by two authors in particular. One of them is Neil Anderson, who's a Christian counselor who wrote a book called Victory Over Darkness. And then there's another author whose name is Chip Dodd, who wrote a book about the voice of the heart. And so I'm crediting those guys because I'm not smart enough to come up with this on my own. But when we think about confession, oftentimes, when we confess sin, what I didn't realize for a long time is that usually, coupled with that sin, is a lie that we were believing in the first place, that led to that sin. And let me change the way I say that if that was a bit confusing. So, the action that you produced, the sin that you carried out came from a place in your heart. And a lot of times what the enemy does is that he'll sell us lies in our hearts. And then those lies will produce the fruit of sin in our lives. Just how when we listen to the voice of Jesus and when we listen to the Spirit, Paul says in Galatians 5 that the fruit of that is love and joy and peace and patience and kindness. The fruit of listening to the Spirit is flourishing, is all those things, love and joy and peace and patience. But the fruit of listening to the lies of the enemy is death. And so oftentimes when we confess sin in our lives, there's also a lie that we need to identify. And how this looked in my life was for the longest time, I had this underlying belief that I thought God was going to leave me. And really, that fear, that lie that God's going to leave, was based on how well I could perform the Christian life, or how good I could be at performing my Christian duties. And so I just really believed that God cared about me because of what I could do for him. And I really believed that why he even bothered with me was because of how good I could do. And I didn't realize that lie just was underneath a lot of the sin patterns in my life, a lot of the struggles I had in past years as a Christian just came from believing that lie that God was going to leave. Now, my theology and my doctrine that I get from my Bible tells me otherwise, right? That God doesn't leave his children. Romans 8, one of the most amazing passages in the Bible, at the very end, the culmination says that nothing can separate us from the love of God. But the problem was I didn't confess my belief. So what you have to understand is that when we confess an action, if we'll sit with the Holy Spirit long enough, I just believe that he'll reveal to us, what lie did I believe that led me to this point? And so even though it's not true that God will leave his children. When I say to confess that, I mean to confess it as a lie. And so for me, how that looked was, God, I know this isn't true. I know that you never leave your children, but I confess that I believe otherwise. In my heart, I trust this lie, and I believe this lie over the truth that's revealed in your word. And so I would just encourage us as we're thinking about the sermon, that we really need to sit with God and ask him to show us how these lies, how these mistruths, if you will, influence the sin that we confess. And so I've just found in my own walk a lot of power and confession that comes from confessing those lies, a lot of freedom that comes from acknowledging, man, I believe this, and I know it's wrong, but man, it keeps me up at night. It causes me anxiety. It stresses me out because I'm just not willing to admit it. Right, because my theology, my doctrine, it tells me this, and so to admit this belief, it feels weak, it feels flawed. And the good news of the gospel is you are weak, you are flawed. I am flawed, I am weak, and we have to be confident enough in God that we need to be able to confess, Lord, I just believe this about you. I believe that you're harsh. I believe that you're a father who isn't concerned with healing me, that you're only concerned with how I adhere to religious rules. Like these are lies that find their way into our lives from the enemy that we just have to confess. God, I believe this and it's not true. Help me believe otherwise. And so I would just speak that life to you today, that confessing lies is almost as important as confessing the very sins we commit.